Behind the chandeliers and champagne glasses, secrets waited to be exposed, and all it took was one man, ordinary, unseen, carrying his own battles, to spark the moment that the city's most powerful CEO could never forget. The Lancaster Hotel glowed like a jewel against the city skyline, its grand ballroom alive with glitter and gold. Chandeliers dripped light across marble floors, polished so smooth they reflected every shimmer of silk and every gleam of polished shoes. A string quartet played near the stage, their music rising above the hum of voices and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. It was charity night, the kind of evening where fortunes were displayed not only through donations, but through gowns, jewels, and the subtle battles of status. For most, it was an evening of appearances. For one man, it was simply another shift. He moved quietly through the room, carrying trays laden with champagne flutes, his black uniform blending into the shadows cast by towering arrangements of white roses. He was steady, efficient, and unnoticed. A single dad working his second job of the week, he had long since learned the art of invisibility. The wealthy guests didn't look at him. They looked through him, the way they looked through every server who made their night seamless. Yet he noticed everything. The men with cufflinks who laughed too loudly, the women in glittering gowns who measured each other in silence, the business tycoons locking eyes in brief moments of calculation before shifting to polite smiles. To him, the ballroom wasn't a celebration, but a chessboard, each guest a piece moving with careful precision, and at the center of it all, entering with the ease of one accustomed to power, was the CEO. The room adjusted itself as he arrived. Conversations dipped, then swelled again, all threaded with whispers of his name. He carried himself like a man who never asked permission to exist, his tailored suit cut sharp, his silver hair immaculately in place. He greeted donors with a nod, accepted compliments with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Cameras flashed as he shook hands, his presence the kind of gravity that shifted everyone else's orbit. From his place near the back, the single dad watched, not out of envy, but observation. He had no illusions about wealth or power. Life had stripped those away long ago. Tonight he was here to do a job, to make sure no glass went empty, no guest went unattended. Still, he couldn't shake the faint tension in the air. The music played on, the lights sparkled, but beneath it there was something unspoken, a silence that pressed against the gilded edges of the night. The charity gala was meant to shine, to prove that those with more could give to those with less. But the single dad knew better than to believe in flawless stories. There were always cracks, and he had learned to spot them. In a room full of wealth and power, he remained invisible. Yet before the night ended, he would be the one remembered. The crowd sparkled with confidence, their laughter carrying across the marble floor like music of its own. Tailored tuxedos, diamond necklaces, shoes polished to mirrors, every guest seemed carved out of wealth itself. Yet behind the steady rhythm of trays moving between tables and glasses refilled without pause was a man whose life was nothing like theirs. He had become a master of moving quietly, of slipping between clusters of people without disturbing a single thread of conversation. Every step was practiced. Every smile was polite but fleeting. To the guests he was only part of the scenery, as essential yet invisible as the chandeliers above. But beneath the pressed uniform and steady hands was a man carrying the weight of a world no one here could imagine. 3 years had passed since his wife's illness had stolen her from him, leaving him to rebuild a life that often felt like it had shattered beyond repair. The bills had not stopped when her heartbeat did. They multiplied, one envelope after another, each demanding what he no longer had. He had taken shifts wherever he could, hotel lobbies, late-night kitchens, weekend banquets like this one, anything that meant keeping the lights on and the rent paid. He had no luxury of grief. Survival didn't allow long pauses. The ballroom glowed with excess, but in his mind lived memories of quiet dinners at a small kitchen table, his wife's laughter filling a modest apartment, their plans drawn not in millions, but in simple hopes, stability, peace, enough time together. Life had rewritten those plans with cruelty. Tonight, he carried trays instead of dreams. He kept his head down, but his eyes, always sharp, always noticing, wandered across the room. They stopped at the CEO. It wasn't jealousy that made him pause, but recognition. Here was a man who stood taller, not just by height, but by presence, commanding the space with the smallest gesture. When he spoke, others leaned closer. When he paused, silence followed. The contrast was almost cruel. One man born into a world where respect was expected, and another forced to earn it every hour of every day. He adjusted the tray in his hand, the weight familiar, grounding him. What would it feel like, he wondered, to carry influence instead of glasses? To have people remember his face, not dismiss it? The thought passed quickly. He had no time for such questions. Yet the seed had been planted. The night moved on, laughter rising and falling, champagne flowing like a river. No one saw him. No one knew his story. But the room held its breath for a moment. It did not yet know was coming. And when it arrived, this quiet, unseen man would no longer be part of the background. He would be the very center of it. All eyes seemed to turn when he stepped into the room, as though the music itself bent to his rhythm. The CEO carried his presence like a tailored suit, sharp, exact, leaving no space for error. Applause rose politely as he approached the stage, not because he demanded it, but because people had been trained to offer it. His name was printed across the evening program, his company had funded half the gala, and his reputation filled the space long before he did. From a distance, he looked every bit the image of control. His smile was precise, the kind that could charm a boardroom or disarm an opponent. His handshake lingered just long enough to signal respect without warmth. Every gesture was measured, every expression polished by years of practice. Around him, the wealthy leaned closer, eager to be noticed, their words dripping with flattery. But for all their admiration, not one dared cross the invisible wall he had built. He was admired, yes, but he was also untouchable. Yet behind the glittering mask was a man already worn thin. His eyes, a piercing steel blue, scanned the ballroom like a general on a battlefield, counting allies and enemies with the same cold precision. The smile never left his lips, but in the seconds between conversations, a shadow of fatigue passed across his face. He carried secrets beneath his suit, choices that had bought him power but cost him something quieter, harder to measure. The gala was supposed to be his triumph. His company had pledged millions. His name was on every banner, and the city's press would capture his generosity as easily as they captured the champagne towers. But triumph carried its own weight. Every light seemed harsher when it followed you, every compliment another reminder of the role you had to perform. He paused near a group of donors, raising a glass to acknowledge their support. For a fleeting second, as the stem trembled slightly in his hand, he looked almost human, almost vulnerable. But just as quickly, he dismissed the moment, tightening his grip, offering a joke that made them laugh on cue. The mask snapped back into place, but the crack had been seen, if only by those who knew how to watch. Loneliness clung to him like a shadow, invisible to the crowd intoxicated by his presence. He moved through the evening surrounded by people, yet untouched by connection. Conversations ended with his smile, not with shared warmth. Admiration filled the air, but it was admiration built on distance, not intimacy. He had built an empire on perfection, and perfection demanded armor. But armor, worn too long, grows heavy. Tonight, beneath chandeliers and whispered praises, the man who seemed untouchable revealed, if only for an instant, that even power comes with its burdens. Dinner service flowed like choreography, servers weaving in and out of the glittering crowd with trays of silver and crystal. The room buzzed with polite laughter, glasses raised, and conversations layered with business, ambition, and shallow charm. To most, it was just another performance of wealth and civility. But to the man carrying the tray near the head table, it was something else entirely. A stage where even the smallest detail could be noticed if you knew where to look. From the corner of his eye, he caught it, a tremor so faint it would have passed as nothing more than a trick of light. The CEO, seated among dignitaries and investors, reached for a glass of wine. His hand, steady when commanding a crowd, shook slightly as he tried to lift it. The smile on his lips remained flawless, his posture impeccable, but the faint ripple in the glass betrayed a weakness no one else dared acknowledge. The guests at the table looked away, pretending not to notice. In this world, politeness meant silence, and silence meant letting a man keep his mask. To draw attention to it would have been unforgivable, and so they laughed louder, shifted their focus, let him wrestle with the moment alone. But the single dad did not look away. He moved forward with quiet confidence, lowering his tray as though it were part of the routine. With a smooth gesture, he offered a fresh glass, steady in his hand. He didn't linger, didn't announce his presence. He simply replaced the trembling burden with calm ease, leaving the CEO's dignity untouched. Their eyes met for the briefest of seconds, one pair steady, respectful, the other caught off guard. It was nothing, at least to the crowd. A server doing his job, nothing more. Yet to the man who had built his life on control, it was something rare. No pity, no pretense, just respect, quietly given. The CEO inclined his head slightly, a motion so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. But the exchange was real, silent, heavy with meaning. For him, kindness was currency he rarely encountered without cost. For the single dad, it was instinct, born not from calculation, but from a lifetime of carrying burdens without complaint. The moment passed quickly. The music swelled, conversation resumed, and the gala carried on as though nothing had shifted. But something had. A thread, invisible to everyone else, had been woven between two men who lived in opposite worlds. Neither could yet name it, but it lingered in the quiet of that glance, the weight of that gesture. It wasn't money or power that shifted the night. It was a moment so small, most missed it. But it was enough to change the course of everything that would follow. The night pressed on, the ballroom glowing brighter as the hours deepened. Laughter swelled in bursts, the orchestra moved into a livelier tempo, and waiters carried silver trays like soldiers in formation. Yet beneath the glitter and practiced elegance, a quieter rhythm pulsed. Whispers. They travelled like smoke, unseen yet suffocating. A guest leaned to another, murmuring about the CEO's stiff posture. A pair of socialites lowered their voices, wondering if his hand had trembled earlier, or if it was only the wine. Near the back, a small group of investors exchanged sidelong glances, their smiles never faltering, even as doubt sharpened behind their eyes. Perfection was expected, demanded. Any flaw, however slight, was dissected and measured. Tonight, the whispers carried weight, but the murmurs weren't only about him. The single dad, moving steadily through the crowd, drew his own kind of judgment. "Too tall for a server," one guest muttered. "Moves like he doesn't belong here." Another scoffed, noting the simple polish on his shoes compared to the staff's uniform shine. To them, worth was stitched into the fabric of a suit, measured in watches and last names. He carried none of it. He was the shadow among light, the kind they dismissed until they needed him. Yet while others ignored him, the CEO could not, seated at the center table, surrounded by polished laughter and empty flattery, his gaze returned again and again to the man who should have been invisible. At first, it was instinct, a flicker of memory from that brief exchange. Then it became curiosity. Who was this man who moved with such calm, who looked at him not with fear, not with calculation, but with a respect that asked for nothing in return? The CEO shifted in his seat, brushing off another toast offered in his honor. The words around him blurred, empty praises piling higher like decorations on a cake already too sweet. He smiled, he nodded, but his thoughts strayed. His eyes sought the one figure who did not clamor for attention. The single dad felt it, though he never lifted his gaze for long. Years of hard living had taught him the weight of being watched. Still, he carried on, pouring drinks, clearing plates, navigating the crowd with quiet precision. He didn't belong in their world, but tonight he had been noticed. And being noticed by the wrong or perhaps the right person could shift the ground beneath his feet. Around them, the ballroom gleamed with perfection, but cracks were widening. Doubt lingered in whispers. Curiosity burned in glances. The glitter couldn't hide it. In a room built on appearances, one truth was about to cut through the noise. The music softened, and the mood in the room shifted with it. Conversations that once seemed harmless now carried sharper edges, polished into civility but cutting all the same. At the CEO's table, three men leaned closer, their smiles fixed. Their words dipped in honey, yet barbed beneath the sweetness. One raised a glass, praising his endless perfection with a tone that carried more bite than admiration. Another asked about recent business moves, framed as curiosity but laced with doubt. The third, bolder than the rest, mentioned rumors of cracks in his empire, cloaked in the guise of concern. It was a familiar ritual, rivals pressing at weak points, testing how well a man held his mask. The CEO smiled, deflecting with charm, his voice steady, his posture unyielding. But his eyes betrayed the effort. Each word spoken at his expense was a small stone tossed into a pond, rippling outward, drawing more attention than he wished. The crowd sensed it. Heads tilted subtly toward the exchange, ears straining behind polite laughter. Some guests hoped for spectacle, the mighty slipping in full view. In their world, one stumble could feed gossip for months. From across the room, the single dad saw more than words. He noticed the tension in the CEO's shoulders, the faint twitch in his jaw as he forced his smile. He recognized it not as arrogance, but as strain, the look of a man cornered by those who wanted to see him fall. The single dad balanced his tray, moving closer, invisible to everyone but keenly aware of the storm gathering. He had no stake in the CEO's empire, no reason to care whether the man held his ground or faltered. Yet something about the scene struck him deeper. He knew what it was to be surrounded, to hide pain behind a mask, to face a crowd eager for weakness. Instinct stirred in him, quiet, patient, waiting. The CEO laughed off another barb, raising his glass as though dismissing the weight of their words. The room clapped politely, convinced the show of control was unshakable. But the single dad, standing just beyond the glow of chandeliers, knew better. The gala was supposed to celebrate power, but power was slipping through polished fingers. And though he said nothing, though he remained just a shadow in their world, he could feel it. The night was turning, and his part in it was far from over. The storm that had been whispering through the ballroom finally broke. One rival leaned too close, his voice louder now, cutting across the music. "You've built an empire on appearances," he said, his words framed as praise, but weighted with venom. But some of us wonder how long perfection can last. The laughter that followed wasn't warm. It was sharp, brittle, and hungry. A second rival pressed in, adding, "Perhaps this gala is less about charity, more about reminding everyone you're still untouchable. Is that it?" The third delivered the final blow, his smile thin as glass. "Or maybe you're simply a man past his prime, hiding cracks beneath chandeliers." The room stilled. Forks paused midway to plates. Glasses froze before lips. The orchestra faltered, strings quivering into silence. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward the head table, waiting for the response. The CEO's jaw tightened, his smile holding, but barely. He had weathered storms in boardrooms, hostile takeovers, betrayals dressed as business. Yet here, in a ballroom designed to celebrate him, the assault felt different, personal, public, a spectacle waiting to be devoured. And then, from the periphery, a voice spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding. But it carried a calm weight that cut through the tension sharper than any insult. "Gentlemen," the single dad said, his tone steady, respectful, but unyielding. "Perhaps the evening would be better served by remembering why we're here. Charity isn't about testing power, it's about offering it." The words fell like a stone into still water. Heads turned, startled. Guests blinked, surprised that a man in uniform, a servant in their eyes, had spoken at all. The rivals scoffed, half amused, half offended. But there was no aggression in his stance, no defiance in his expression, only composure. He held the tray in one hand, balanced effortlessly, as though nothing could shake him. His eyes, clear and unwavering, met theirs without challenge, only truth. The silence stretched, heavy, and then began to shift. A few guests lowered their eyes, ashamed of their eagerness to watch another man falter. Others whispered, intrigued. The orchestra, uncertain, held its breath. The CEO looked up at him. For the first time all evening, his smile slipped, not in weakness, but in revelation. Across the polished table he saw something no rival could purchase, no donor could imitate. Strength, not of wealth, but of character. The rivals leaned back, their smirks brittle now, stripped of power. They had come to draw blood, but the moment had turned, not by force, not by scandal, but by the quiet authority of someone they had dismissed as invisible. The single dad bowed his head slightly, as if excusing himself, and stepped back into the shadows. The gala exhaled, sound returning in cautious waves, clinking glasses, resumed chatter, nervous laughter. But the air was changed. In that instant, the quiet man rewrote the script of the night, and the CEO, for the first time in years, realized power wasn't always worn in suits or measured in numbers. Sometimes it walked quietly, unseen, until the moment it chose to be known. When the music returned, softer this time, and conversation resumed in carefully measured tones, one truth lingered. The quiet man had changed the course of the night. Guests still whispered, some in hushed admiration, others in disdain that a servant had dared to speak. But no one could deny the shift. Power no longer rested fully at the head table. It hovered somewhere else, somewhere unexpected. The single dad moved back into his role as though nothing had happened. He carried trays, refilled glasses, cleared plates with the same calm precision. Yet his composure, the ease with which he had diffused a storm, did not go unnoticed. Eyes followed him now. He was no longer invisible. Whispers trailed behind him. Who is he? Where did he learn to hold himself like that? Not just any man could silence rivals with a few measured words. Not just any worker could stand before power without trembling. The CEO sat quietly, his mind replaying the moment. He had built a life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, deference, money, protection. Yet here was a man who had offered respect without flattery, who had defended dignity without seeking attention. His presence was not performance. It was instinct, and that instinct could only be forged by something deeper. The truth of it lay far from the chandeliers. Years earlier, before tragedy, before bills piled like mountains, the single dad had lived another life, a life of discipline, routine, and resilience. His hands, though steady now on a silver tray, still remembered the weight of training. He had once served in places where composure meant survival, where keeping calm under pressure wasn't a choice, but a necessity. The world had tested him long before this gala, and those tests had carved strength into his bones. But when his wife fell ill, the path he knew shattered. He left behind ambition, career, identity, everything, because family demanded more than recognition ever could. He traded uniforms and titles for long nights at her side, for steady paychecks that kept medicine on the table, for sacrifice that no one but him would ever fully measure. And when she was gone, his life narrowed further. One focus remained: to provide, to endure, to raise what was left of his world with dignity. He didn't seek glory. He had learned that glory fades. What stayed was responsibility, the quiet kind that didn't need applause. Tonight, when he stepped into conflict, it wasn't to shine. It was reflex, an instinct honed by loss, by discipline, by love too fierce to let dignity be trampled in silence. The CEO, watching him from across the room, saw none of the whispers, none of the speculation. He saw only a man who carried strength differently, not draped in wealth, not displayed for admiration. Strength that lived in silence, waiting for the moment it was needed. He wasn't just a worker in the shadows. He was someone forged in fire long before this night. The gala continued on the surface, laughter resuming in practiced waves, the orchestra weaving music back into the air as though nothing had happened. But in the CEO's chest, the night felt altered, heavy in a way he could not shake. He excused himself with a nod, retreating into a side corridor lined with portraits of philanthropists past. Their painted faces stared down at him, all composed, all confident, all symbols of legacies he had once aspired to outshine. He stopped at the tall mirror near the cloakroom, the kind meant for guests to adjust their ties or gowns before re-entering the glow of the ballroom. But when he looked, he did not see perfection staring back. He saw the tremor in his hand, the mask that had almost slipped, and behind it, the emptiness he had refused to name. For years, his reflection had been a reassurance. Power made him untouchable. Wealth made him admirable. Influence made him necessary. Tonight, none of it had shielded him. Tonight, a stranger had stood in the gap, not with riches or a name, but with nothing more than calm conviction. Humiliation burned in him first. He hated that others had witnessed it, hated that his rivals had pressed and nearly triumphed. But beneath the sting was something quieter, more dangerous because it was honest: gratitude. That man, the one in the plain uniform, had preserved his dignity when it could have shattered. And he had done it without seeking credit, without expecting anything. The CEO pressed his palm to the edge of the mirror, leaning closer. Was his empire built on the wrong values? Had he mistaken perfection for strength, when true strength came not from appearance, but from endurance, from sacrifice, from a steadiness that wealth could never buy? The thought unsettled him. He had risen by building walls, by demanding flawless performance from everyone around him, including himself. Yet tonight, the one who had reached across the cracks was someone who owed him nothing. A man who should have remained invisible had become the anchor in the storm. Behind him, the murmur of the ballroom drifted like an echo. The single dad had returned to his duties, carrying trays, moving with the same quiet rhythm, as though the moment had already passed. He expected nothing, no recognition, no reward, not even acknowledgement. That, more than anything, pressed against the CEO's pride. For the first time in years, his reflection unsettled him. The mask had cracked, and in that crack he glimpsed, not weakness, but the truth he had ignored for too long. Power without humanity was hollow. Perfection without compassion was brittle. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was not too late to learn from the man who had reminded him. The gala wound down with the same polished grace it had begun. Guests drifted toward the exits, their laughter softer now, their promises of donations sealed with handshakes and photographs. The chandeliers still sparkled, but the night's energy had dimmed into a hum of goodbyes. Staff moved quietly through the aftermath, clearing tables, folding linens, returning order to the room that only hours before had felt untouchable. The single dad carried one last tray toward the service hall, his body weary, but his mind steady. For him, the night was finished, another shift completed, another paycheck earned. He did not linger on what had happened. He had not stepped forward for recognition. He had acted because it was right, because silence would have left dignity crushed beneath arrogance. That was enough, but not for the CEO. From the shadow of the corridor he appeared, not with the commanding stride of earlier, not surrounded by admirers, but alone. His jacket was unbuttoned, his tie loosened, his carefully crafted armor finally stripped down to something human. For a moment he simply watched, as though measuring the right to speak. Then, with a voice quieter than anyone in the ballroom had ever heard from him, he said, "Wait." The single dad turned, surprised, but not unsettled. The CEO stepped closer, his words deliberate. "I owe you more than I can say." Tonight could have gone differently. "You didn't just help me, you reminded me." There was no speech of grandeur, no offer of money disguised as thanks. Just a man acknowledging another man, not as servant and master, but as equals standing on the same ground. The single dad inclined his head, his answer simple. "You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone should." The CEO's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in thought. He knew better. Not everyone would have risked breaking silence. Not everyone would have chosen dignity over comfort. And that was why this man was different. After a pause, the CEO spoke again. "Still, I would like to know more about you. Perhaps meet outside of this." His tone was not commanding, not polished. It carried curiosity, even humility, an invitation, not an order. For the single dad, it was unexpected. He had walked into the night invisible and prepared to leave the same way. Yet here stood the man everyone else measured themselves against, offering a chance, not charity, not pity, but respect. A door quietly opened. He nodded once, cautious but steady. Perhaps, the CEO smiled faintly, not the public mask, but something smaller, real. Then we'll speak again. One act of kindness had set in motion a change neither man could undo. The gala faded into memory for most, another polished evening tucked neatly into society pages. But, for two men, its echo lingered long after the lights dimmed. Weeks passed, yet the single dad noticed the difference almost immediately. He was no longer invisible. The restaurant where he worked began receiving unexpected inquiries, recommendations whispered by people who had attended that night. Clients remembered his calm presence, not the wines he poured, but the way he had stood when the room wavered. His supervisors, once indifferent, now glanced at him with quiet respect. The smallest gestures, doors held open, voices softened when speaking his name, hinted that something had shifted. But the greatest change came from the CEO himself. Their meeting after the gala had not been a courtesy easily forgotten. True to his word, the CEO sought him out again, not with extravagance but with intent. A simple conversation turned into another and another. Slowly, a door opened into a different kind of world, not one of servitude, but one of trust. The CEO had been working on a new project, something outside the relentless corridors of power, a program meant to rebuild credibility and restore values long overshadowed by ambition. He extended an offer, not for charity, not as payment for that night, but because he had recognized in the single dad a quality rare even among his closest advisors, steadiness born of hardship, strength without arrogance. At first, the single dad hesitated. He was used to scraping by, to living quietly without drawing attention. A larger role meant risk, exposure, change. Yet, when he thought of the nights alone with bills stacked on the counter, when he remembered the hollow looks of pity he had endured before, he realized this offer was different. It was not pity, it was respect. He accepted. The transition was not grand. There were no headlines, no sudden rise to glory. But slowly his life began to widen. Days once spent juggling endless shifts now carried purpose. He contributed not just as an employee, but as a man whose voice was valued. The CEO, in turn, changed as well. Where he had once demanded perfection, he began to seek sincerity. Where he had once measured loyalty in numbers, he began to measure it in trust. Together, the unlikely pair built something new, each balancing the other. One offered resilience carved from loss, the other offered humility forged through awakening. The gala had ended, but its echo was only beginning. For the single dad, it marked the end of invisibility. For the CEO, it marked the end of isolation. And for both, it became the start of a path neither could have walked alone. Time has a way of stripping nights like the gala down to their bones. The photographs that once filled glossy magazines faded into archives no one revisited. The speeches, rehearsed and applauded in the moment, slipped from memory like sand through open hands. Even the gowns, the glitter, the applause, they blurred into the long line of evenings society had staged before and would stage again. But one moment endured. People remembered the silence, the tension when the air thickened, the weight of whispers ready to consume. And they remembered how it broke, not with wealth, not with power, but with a quiet voice from a man no one had noticed until that night. That was the story retold in hushed admiration, the ripple that carried far beyond chandeliers and marble floors. For the CEO, the legacy of that night was personal. He continued to walk in circles of influence, still carrying the name that once commanded rooms. Yet he was not the same man who had stood armored in perfection. The mask no longer fit as tightly. He had learned to pause, to listen, to measure worth differently. The memory of a stranger's calm strength followed him into boardrooms and decisions, a reminder that power without humanity was brittle. For the single dad, life changed in quieter ways. He was no longer unseen, no longer just the man who carried trays through polished rooms. His presence was valued, his words weighed, his dignity restored not by favor but by recognition. The opportunities that came were not gifts, they were earned, the natural consequence of character revealed at the right moment. He did not seek fame or fortune, only stability, respect, and the chance to build a future not just on survival, but on hope. Though they walked different lives, their paths remained tied by a thread invisible to others. When they crossed, there was no grand display, no performance, only a nod, an acknowledgement between two men forever changed by a night when their roles had reversed and revealed truth. In the end, no fortune was remembered, only the night kindness changed everything. The ballroom that had once glittered with chandeliers became a story whispered long after the lights dimmed. Guests who had attended forgot the menu, the speeches, even the donations pledged. But they did not forget the moment dignity overcame spectacle. That memory lingered, a quiet legacy written not in headlines but in hearts. And so the story closed, not with thunder but with resonance. A reminder to those who watched, those who listened, those who carried it forward. Sometimes the smallest act of courage, the simplest kindness, can hold more weight than years of ambition.